And I'm glad we're here to learn a bit more from our resident, Ivan Lorant. It's not his first time hosting a lovely lecture. Today we're going to talk about the incredible tales of the Panama Canal. So Ivan has has more than 50 years of experience in drainage studies, stormwater management, and water resources engineering. So I hope you get all the knowledge you can get from him in today's lecture, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you for putting this together, Ivan.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I don't want to disappoint you, there will be no music or dancing. It was my dream to go and see the Panama Canal, partly because my background is hydraulic engineering. So it was exactly 10 years ago. 10 years ago, when my wife and I went on a cruise, and the cruise line took us through Panama Canal. On the first day, the ship gave a reception to everybody, and I was chatting with the captain, and I told him how fantastic this whole project is, building the Panama Canal. It has a great history. He said, I'll tell you what, the day before we crossed the canal, why don't you give a talk? We invite the passengers, I give you the theater. It's only 550 seats if you don't mind. I said, no, I don't mind. So I agreed. My wife said, you are crazy. We are on vacation and you are going to work. How are you going to put together a presentation on a ship? Internet is virtually non-existent 10 years ago. So as usual, it turns out my wife was right. I should not have given a presentation. Because it turned out I gave a moving presentation. Yes. I hardly managed to introduce myself when I gave the presentation when the ship went into a storm. And my presentation's most difficult part was keeping my balance and keeping my lunch in my stomach. So the worst part was a huge stage, and I couldn't grab anything. I had to watch and keep my balance. So that was 10 years ago. But why is it that I found it so interesting? Let me tell you. Because the Panama Canal shows how a combination of different political intrigues, total engineering incompetence, twice going companies bankrupt financially. They had total chaotic organization, and yet they managed to construct the canal. By doing so, they had to first form a new country called Panama, and then they have to successfully operate the canal. Until now, climate change. I will talk about it. So my presentation will cover quite a time span, because the early efforts by the French were 150, 200 years ago. Then I talk about how the US decided to take over the French messed up. And then, until recently, the canal was operating quite well. But now the demand of larger containers required larger ships, and the locks had to be larger. So they had to enlarge the canal. Finally, I outlined briefly the operational procedures in the canal. And I hint about the future, what to expect because of climate change. I promise I won't be very technical, because yes, hydraulics can be exciting science for me, or if you are an engineer, maybe if you are a urologist. So, what's the significance of Panama Canal? Just look at this map. What happens if someone wants to send cargo from New York to San Francisco, or the other way around? Without Panama Canal, they have to go 20,900 kilometers before reaching destination. With the canal, it's cut down 8,370 kilometers. Now let's look at the world. Look at the traffic between Asia and Europe, or Asia and the east coast of North America. What a difference if you don't have to go through South America. So it's really a strategic location, Panama. The Spanish ruled what is now Colombia. They established it in way back 1532, after they defeated the Incas. But in 1822, there was a revolution, ended the Spanish rule, and that's when the current Panama joined Colombia, Republic of Colombia. You see, there is the Panama, and this is Colombia. 7 years later, the president of Bolivar said, maybe there should be an access through Panama, and he commissioned a study to build a canal. And the study recommended not to proceed because of the difficulty with the jungle excavation and building the project. 20 years later, the Americans said, okay, if we cannot build a canal, let's build a railroad. And that will allow us unloading at one end the ship, put it on the rail will take it to the other end, and you can reload it. So here is the first construction proceeding by the US support, 1849, 6 years. It cost them 8 million. Estimate 1 million, because it was so difficult to figure out the cost. And sadly, up to 10,000 workers died during the rail construction. But this is what happened. There is the Atlantic, here is the Pacific, and it was decided that with this railway line, one could connect any ship where the people or goods at Panama are unloaded, put it on train, and it can be put back on another ship at the Atlantic end. Here is, I found an original ticket for that railroad, and dated April the 21st, 1856. For a Mr. Keeler, and it cost, I think $25 in 1856, and it was good only for the trip by steamers originating from New York. So that was working quite well for a number of years. But by 1869, the US President Grant said maybe there should be a canal, and he called for the construction. He sent 7 different expeditions to carry out the survey, to find the best route, and to study the practicability of a canal construction. So that's another 5 years of survey. At the end, when the results came back from the surveys, Grant believed that it's impossible to build through the Panama jungle a canal. In the meantime, the Germans getting interested. Here is the survey the Germans did between 1880 and 86 of a possible Panama Canal. What is so interesting, they said, but maybe there is a better way if we go to the adjacent country, Nicaragua, and build a canal here. Why? Because here a large part of the potential route would be through a lake, very large lake, which would not have to be built, excavated, no locks required. So the Germans were interested, but they couldn't decide Panama or Nicaragua. The French finished Suez Canal. They were so happy, and they decided if we're so successful in Suez, why can't we build the Panama Canal? And they raised 300 million francs. And here it is, you see, Canal Interoceanic, 300 million francs were raised. And they started in 81 to excavate the canal. 7 years later, they built up their labor force to 40,000. Most of them came from the West Indies. Unfortunately, death again, just like the rail construction, here the death toll by 1889 was 22,000. And some of those, 5,000, were French citizens. So there was quite an outcry in France. So after 8 years, work stopped in 1889 because the company went bankrupt. And all the 800,000 French stockholders lost their investment. So the mistake the French made, number one, it wasn't Suez. Compare Suez excavation with Panama's jungle. The other mistake they made is to build a level canal. So a level canal would mean that you look at the sea level of Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean, and you simply maintain that level in a canal. But that means you have to excavate what's above in order to have you have reached the level required for a level canal. So it's a hell of a lot of excavation to connect the two ends. So 5 years later, a second French company was created to continue the project. And they appointed, they retained Eiffel. He was famous, his tower just finished, and they retained him partly because of his prestige to revive the Panama Canal project. And he was the first who said locks should be built rather than just digging horizontally through the hills. But unfortunately, the second French company went also bankrupt in 1904. They accused Alpha of misleading investors, and the famous man was sentenced to prison, but later he was pardoned. So by that time, with the second bankruptcy, the French had sunk in more than 260 million on the Canal venture. So just to give a postmortem of the French thing. Well, first they designed a level canal without locks, thinking it's another Suez. And then the project was plagued by the rains, mudslides, poor planning, poor engineering decisions, and this is another thing. Yellow fever and malaria killed 20,000 workers. But never mind, the US came to rescue the project. In 1897, the US government sent 2 commissions to look at the best routes through the canal. First one through Panama, and then they said, if it's through Panama, we'll purchase the French rights and also the instruments, the machinery. But maybe there is a better route through Nicaragua. So back again, Nicaragua appeared. But then later, they decided, no, that's not the right one. So the US proposed to Colombia, first of all, a $10 million payment to lease in perpetuity the land required for the canal. It took a lot of negotiations, but by 1903, Colombia said no. The reason it was rejected, because US did not provide sufficient compensation, and also Colombia was worried about sovereignty. But the local citizens loved it. Wouldn't it be nice to have a canal? We have all the income, we have work opportunity. They said, that's fantastic. And they started revolting. So Roosevelt decided this is great, and he sent financial support to the rebels. And Colombia was very worried, so they decided to send troops to occupy the canal works. But they couldn't reach the works. Why? Because the Americans owned the railroad and they removed all trains. So there the Colombian army stuck out at the harbor. And when they saw the US warship Nashville coming, Colombians withdrew. So the local population then, with US support, decided that the best route is to have an independent country called Panama. So the US sat down to negotiate with Panama a treaty which gave Americans the right to construct the canal. The Panama received $10 million in payment. Also 40 million were paid to Panama to get the French assets. But they insisted that the canal zone to be controlled by the US. So there is Panama, which was formed in 1903. A very small country, population like a large city, 3.9 million. They formed their own flag, and they even had a motto for the benefit of the world. So that's the new country, Panama. So the Americans decided it's time now to start digging in 1904. First they make the same mistake as the French, attempting to build the sea level canal. But they ran into problems. The French equipment was lousy, always broke down. Then again, yellow fever, the malaria. Finally, the engineer couldn't cope and resigned. A new chief engineer was sent in 1905, and he completely reorganized the project, recruited new laborers, ordered new equipment, and devised efficient way to speed up work. And this is very important, convinced Roosevelt to build a different canal from what they tried to do in the past. And this time he said, we should include locks, and we have to build a lake to fill fresh water into the locks. So that makes illustrate the advantage of locks. Here are the two ends, Pacific and Atlantic, and at each end of the canal there are 3 locks. Now, as I said, there will be a need for a reservoir. Rainwater will be collected because every time they operate the gates, they need water, which eventually is discharged into the sea. So the role of the reservoir was crucial. Now, if you want to have a level canal, you have to excavate all this down to the sea level. But if you decide to build the locks, you only excavate the blue area. So you see, it's much less excavation needed. So now looking at the original drawing prepared for the works, you can see here are the 2 ends, Pacific and Atlantic. As I said, there is a storage lake called Gatun Lake, and there are the 3 locks at each end. What is so interesting, with modern instruments, they found the sea level is not the same. The Pacific mean sea level is 24.5 centimeters higher than the Atlantic, which was a shock to everybody. So here is an explanation to show you. When a ship enters a lock, you close the downstream end of the canal, the gate, and open the upstream end. When you open this gate, the water can go in, and it will be a new level. Now let's see whether this works. No, it does not.
Wow.
Okay, it doesn't work. There was a way I could show you the movement, but anyway, let's continue. So this lock business, well, guess who invented the locks? Leonardo da Vinci.
Why did he need to? Why did he need to do that? There weren't any locks?
You see, they were discussing building canals through Italy. And here is the original drawing from 1497 by Leonardo. And as you can see, even if you can't see it clearly, nobody could read his writings because he developed a secret way to hide the important details. Only after his death, someone accidentally put a mirror in front of the writing, and that's when you could read it. Anyway, his has a fascinating story. I have seen his letter written to the ruler in Milan, saying, "I'm so sorry, I have to do some paintings because my life ambition is to become a hydraulic engineer." So that's an interesting twist.
He had lots of fun.
Here is the only surviving lock by Leonardo da Vinci. So, as I pointed out, there is Gatun Lake, which is located approximately 30 meters above sea level. The US also had a problem. Again, the diseases, it was very hot, and the climate is very severe. Over a 2-year period, close to 50% of the workers had been hospitalized. Yellow fever and malaria. They didn't quite understand how malaria or yellow fever is spreading. So they couldn't understand that it's mosquito control. So what they decided is to try and spray oil, helping to alleviate some of the problem of the bodies. So these are the hardships the laborers faced. Rain, heavy work, and dangerous work. Already racial tensions between the West Indian and white laborers. Why? They paid differently. And the fear of the older workers had the fear of catching yellow fever or malaria. So, after a while, many of the skilled American workers deserted. But eventually they learned. As work progressed, facilities were improved. And they gave incentives to the workers not to abandon. They even sponsored baseball games, championship, in 1907. As I mentioned, they had this problem with malaria, and they had difficulties figuring out. They used whiskey to treat patients, or eggnog, I don't understand why. They rubbed kerosene and oil on the scene. They even provided ice bath with mustard. But what's important is to keep the patient reasonably comfortable and hope that they survive. President Roosevelt visited the works in 1906. He was very, very enthusiastic about the project. The way the construction proceeded was using dynamite and cutting the hills for higher ground. Here are original photos they are trying to go through with their excavation. Also, by 1909, they started constructing the locks. This is very interesting. The dimension of the locks was selected on the dimension of a US Navy ship. So that was important. So here is a photo of the early construction of a lock. These locks were quite large, look, 33.5 meter wide and 305 meter long. And 3 locks could lift or lower ships by approximately 26 meters. Now, what is very important, no ship is allowed to use its own power, because the propeller could damage the lock. So what they had, they called mules. These mules were tied to the ship and pulled the ship through the locks. These mules were quite heavy, and because some ships needed 8 mules, 4 on one side, the 4 is made up 2 in the front and 2 in the back, another 4 on the other side of the ship. And because there is quite an elevation difference between the locks, the mules had to climb up and go down along the locks. Very interesting how the workers were paid. Mainly white workers and skilled craftsmen were paid in gold. The West Indians were paid in silver. Europeans slept in less crowded barracks and had more privileges, even tables and chairs at the dining area. Here I found a receipt of a skilled laborer's pay. This man was a trained foreman, and he was paid $150 per month. The common value is $4,000. The West Indian workers had a hard life, working in 120-degree Fahrenheit heat, and they were carrying out all the dynamite explosions, and they had to watch frequent mudslides. It was so dangerous, the dynamiting, that they were never sure that they returned home after a day's work, and they left all their personal belongings with friends behind. I was pleasantly surprised. There were women workers there, and they were hired as nurses, teachers, copyists, clerks, and lawyers. So after 33 years of work, cost of $350 million, in 1914, the canal was opened. These are the original photographs taken during the opening. It was the most expensive construction in the world, and it's regarded, or at least was regarded, as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Unfortunately, tensions between US and Panama increased over the canal control. By January 1964, Panamanians, mainly young people, students, attempted to raise the flag inside the US zone, the Panamanian flag inside the US zone. And they rioted over the canal sovereignty. They needed a transfer to Panama. It got so extreme that Panama severed diplomatic relations with the US. And the Life magazine had this famous cover about the uprising of the students. And even today, Panama observes January the 9th, and they call it Martyrs' Day. It took many, many years, but finally, in 1999, the control of the canal was transferred, and what is important, peacefully, to Panama in 1999. So now the Panamanians are responsible for the canal and its operation. After 90 years of operation, because of the increase in worldwide shipping, was driven a rapidly expanding economies in Asia. They needed more capacity, larger ships, and the larger ships couldn't go through the small locks. So because of the cargo ships got so much larger, they had to redesign all the 3+3, altogether 6 locks. And what was needed is doubling at least the canal capacity. It's a Spanish company who got the project, 3.1 billion, to build the enlarged locks. And construction for the enlargement started in 2007. Now, just to illustrate to you, there are standard shipping containers which have fixed measurement, and depending on the capacity of a ship, they are stacked up so wide and so high to go through the canal. To illustrate the difference, here is the limit the old canal could take with a cargo space of 165,000 cubic meters. And here are the newer, introduced 2014 container ships. Here, and as you can see, it's at least a 3-fold increase in cargo space. So there was a need for larger locks. And also cruise ships. Look at the clearance or the lack of clearance. Imagine maneuvering this through a lock. It's a very, very difficult thing. And another thing, if you expand the canal, you can expand the trade, and it's good for everybody. So look at, here is Panama, and if you increase the lock capacity, you have Asia bring goods to the east coast of US. You can have Europe bring goods to the US west coast, or US can reach South America. So you see, this is fantastic help for an expanded trade. The new lock system, wider and longer chambers, and can handle cargo ships with 2 or 3 times the capacity of old ships. But one thing they had to include is water-saving basins, which I will show in a minute. And the navigation channel had to make it deeper and wider for the larger ships to maneuver. So here is the excavation of the enlarged lock and canal. Some pictures to give you an idea of the magnitude of the project. Now this is something very interesting. There is no way when you increase the flow, you open the flow from one lock into another. You cannot let the flow go into the canal and hit the ship, because the ship will start moving back. So every filling, every emptying of a lock has to be done below the ground. So the water comes up and lifts the ship. So these are the works they have to build down below the locks to convey the flow from one lock to the next. And look at the amount, 425,000 cubic meter water has to rush through to raise a ship. Roughly in 10 minutes, have to raise it 9 meters. And the other thing I mentioned is when the flow goes out from a chamber, it shouldn't go down to the sea. It should be reused, filling a subsequent operation. Here are, to give you an idea of the gate sizes, large gates, 25 meter long, 35 meter high, very thick and weighs 4,000 tons. And here I compare the size of a gate with the building behind. That's a 15-story Panama Treasury building. So you can see the size of these gates. It's really a very heavy structure. So this is what I was referring when I said saving, water saving chambers. So the idea is not to let the flow of the flow which comes from Gatun Lake into the sea, but store it sideways. And so that's how we build these basins, and also quite large. 3 plus 3 plus 3, so 9 basins, 7 meter wide, 400 meter long, and 5.5 meter deep. So this illustrates that this whole transfer goes through down here between the lock and the storage facility. As I pointed out, the demand for fresh water was so big, they couldn't afford to lose all the flow. The enlargement was completed in 2016. Of course, there was overruns for 5.2 billion. It shows the overruns. So now the canal has double capacity. And as a reminder, 200 million liters of fresh water are used in a single passage of a ship, if not stored at the adjacent chambers. And here is the photo of the first ship, container ship, crossing at the opening. Unfortunately, there was some problem, and it hit the wall. How about the Nicaragua Canal? Well, Nicaragua was still in promoting it. So the blue is the alternative route instead of Panama Canal and Nicaragua Canal. And as the German survey showed, a large percent of this would not require excavation because there is a lake already there. And the lake crossing is 106 kilometers, so it's quite long. They said it would only require one lock at each end. Estimated cost $50 billion. Interestingly, the company who was interested was based in Hong Kong, called Nicaragua Canal Development. They asked the Nicaragua government to give them 50-year rights to build and operate the canal and the port. They even wanted a free trade zone and a small airport adjacent to the canal. They promised Nicaragua $10 million annually for 10 years, and thereafter 1% of the revenue. But nothing happened, it all died. So let me illustrate a few things about how they operate the canal. I already pointed out the importance of Panama, but look at the map which shows all the shipping routes of the world. And as you can see, quite a lot of the green lines go through. It's roughly 10% of the world shipping goes through Panama Canal. As far as US, between East and West Coast, 70% of the cargo is from the US. This is a more interesting map. Here is the map showing worldwide marine traffic. It's usually around 160,000 vessels out on the sea. And there is Panama. So what is so interesting and helpful, if you use the same system and turn it into a geo map, you can see the ships. For example, here is Panama Canal, and you can see red ships and green ships. Red means it is a tanker, green it means a container ship. Now, let's say I want to find out what is Narrow Express. I click on it, it immediately comes up a photo of the tanker. It says oil or chemical, and some additional information. It's interesting to see that this one was going at a certain speed, 10.8 kilometer. It's using its engine, and if I would click on the vessel detail, it would give me more information. Now, the way the ships pass the canal now, no more mules. They have tugboats. And usually, depending on the size of the ship, one tugboat at front and one at the back is enough. It's interesting how the pilots practice. They have little ships here, model ships, and that's where they practice using their tugboats, how they could in future use their tugboats. Some statistics. Let's look at the transit statistics from 1915 to 2025. You can see more and more transits going through. But what is fascinating is not the number of transits, it's the tonnage, how it increased, and what happened when they introduced the larger logs. Suddenly it shot up the tonnage. And then unfortunately COVID came and it upset the statistics. The other interesting transit picture is if you look at the monthly transit between the very dry year, that's 2024, and the next year, last year, 2025. So the dry years didn't have enough water in Gatun Lake to allow many ships to cross. So that's very important. Examples of an annual transit. Well, interesting table I found, warships. Look at the US. In the years had 83 warships. Canada only one. Here's another annual transit record showing how many container ships, dry bulk, chemical tankers. These are the car carriers, roughly 800 in a year. The top 10 countries ranked by the volume of cargo, US is definitely one, Canada is down number 9. Now, where is the income coming from? This is what I found out about tolls the shipping company has to pay. It depends on the size of the cargo volume. The maximum for very large ships is $450,000 crossing the 3+3 locks. A cruise ship pays a little bit less. The one cruise I took, the captain whispered into my ear, he paid $250,000 to cross. So it's not peanuts. That's funny. The smallest toll ever paid 36 cents in 1928 by an American, Richard Halliwell, who swam across the
What did you do with that?
It took roughly 9 hours when we crossed, so it's between 8 and 10 hours to pass through the canal. And the total rise and lowering of ships, 26 meters. And this is what my captain was so nervous about. He is not allowed to operate the ship while going through the locks. He allowed me to come and join them. He was nervously standing next to the Panamanian who used radio and talked to the tugboats shepherding us through the canal. So that's an interesting thing. So the canal finally passed 1 million vessels 15, 16 years ago. So now it's over 1 million. As I said, the future can bring uncertainties. There is a definite increase in demand from the lake, first of all by the citizens for domestic supply, but also for the enlarged canal. There are definite changes in precipitations in the Panama area, and we know future climate change will bring more changes. Here is a Panama newsroom release water crisis. Panama lakes at lowest level in 103 years. So this is Gatun Lake, almost dry. Yeah, this is to show you water levels in the Gatun Lake. This is over the January to December period, and this is the elevation, 24 or 27 meters. And as I pointed out, like 2023 was the driest year on record. So they are very worried. They said, that's okay, we are going to build a larger reservoir that will need a new dam to provide the source for canal operation and also for drinking water. Half of Panama's population gets drinking water from that lake. They said by 2027 they have to start constructing this new dam and lake to be ready by 2032. Cost 1.6 billion. Unfortunately, this will require relocating 2,500 residents. And some of the residents are very, very influential, very rich, because they are Russian people who took their money out from Russia and live happily in Panama. Walking on the streets of Panama, you have lots of Russian conversation. It's a very good passport, they love it. So another future, they are cutting trees because of new villages and new cities. But that means now the sedimentation is increasing. They have to dredge this whole system more frequently. So, to finish, Freud's dramatic beginnings to its modern expansion, the Canal, in my opinion, remains one of the greatest engineering achievements. It reminds us that human ingenuity can overcome geography, diseases, politics, and hopefully future climate change. What we need is vision, persistence, and continued cooperation. Finally, I was praying, really, that there will be no problem with this current presentation. The problem is that you remember I was telling you when I talked on the ocean ship, I had difficulty keeping my balance. Well, here it's a different story, because here I'm not worried about the floor moving, I'm worried about keeping my balance. But I came prepared. Thank you. Sorry, it was long, 55 minutes. But thank you for so much.
Fascinating. Wow.
But you see, even if you have no engineering background, it's a fascinating.
It is. And it's so recent. Historically, it's so recent.
Yeah.
I've been through it.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's interesting, the persistence of the human mind.